In the vast, cold darkness of space, the Xylox Empire ruled with an iron grip. They had been around for thousands of years, conquering planet after planet, building an empire that spanned across countless star systems. The Xylox called themselves gods. They believed that no one could ever challenge their power. Their technology was far beyond anything any other race had ever seen, and their warriors were stronger, faster, and nearly immortal. They had crushed all who dared to defy them, and in their eyes, no one else mattered. The Xylox capital planet, Xyloth, was a sprawling city covered in grand temples and towering spires. At the heart of the city stood a massive structure, the Throne of Eternity, where the leaders of the Xylox met to discuss the future of their empire. The leaders, known as the High Council, sat in their thrones, overlooking their empire with pride. They had no fear. Their arrogance was as vast as their power. The humans of Earth are no match for us. One of the High Council members sneered, his voice deep and booming. His name was Zorath, and he was the most powerful of all the Xylox leaders. His eyes glowed with a bright, unnatural light, a sign of his superior strength and energy. Their weapons are primitive. Their ships are slow. They cannot even comprehend the might of the Xylox. Another leader, a female named Kalira, nodded in agreement. We've heard the rumors. A human warship, they say. But it's nothing more than a myth. No human could ever challenge us. The High Council laughed, their voices echoing through the chamber. They had heard whispers of a human ship, one that was said to be unlike any other, but they dismissed it as nothing more than a story told by those who feared them. After all, who could possibly stand against the Xylox? They were the gods of the galaxy. Their ships were unmatched, their warriors unbeatable. They were the rulers of all. The Xylox Empire was vast, and they controlled nearly every planet in their reach. Their soldiers, the Xyloxian elite, were a terrifying sight. With their armored suits and energy weapons, they were nearly unstoppable. The Xylox had conquered countless races, and they believed no one would ever rise up against them. Yet, despite all their power, a quiet fear began to grow among the Xyloxian people. It wasn't loud, but it was there. Whispers spread throughout the empire about a human warship that had appeared out of nowhere, with rumors of its power spreading like wildfire. Some Xylox feared that the humans were preparing for war, but the leaders of the empire remained confident. They were gods, and they could not be defeated. One of the commanders, Captain Velas, walked into the throne room. His armor, a shining silver, reflected the light from the chamber's grand windows. His face was grim, and he knelt before the High Council. "My lords," he said, his voice serious, "there is something you must see. A human ship has entered our territory." Zorath raised an eyebrow. "What nonsense is this, Captain? A human ship? Why are you bothering us with such ridiculous rumors?" Captain Velas took a deep breath. "It's not a rumor, my lord. The ship is real. We've intercepted its signal, and it's heading straight for Xyloth." The room fell silent. The High Council exchanged uneasy glances. They had heard of this human warship, but they never took it seriously. Now, the unthinkable was happening. A human ship was heading straight for their homeworld. Kalira sneered. "Perhaps it's a scouting ship, sent to study our defenses. It is no match for our..." Fleet Soroth's eyes narrowed. He had always been confident, but this was different. Something about this human ship made him uneasy. It wasn't the size of the ship that worried him, it was the fact that it was coming at all. The Xylox had never been challenged by a human. before, will crush them, Zorath said, his voice cold and commanding. Prepare the fleet. This will be over before they even reach our borders. The High Council nodded, and within minutes, the Xylox fleet was mobilizing. Thousands of ships, each armed with the deadliest weapons in the galaxy, lined up in orbit. Around Xyloth, the humans, they thought, would stand no chance against such power. As the Xylox fleet gathered, Captain Velas could feel the tension in the air. He didn't know why, but something told him this battle would be different. He had faced countless enemies, but this felt strange. The human ship wasn't like anything he had seen before. On the human ship, the crew moved with purpose. The warship, though small compared to the mighty Xylox fleet, was armed with weapons that could strike from a distance far greater than the Xylox could imagine. But the humans didn't see themselves as gods. They saw themselves as survivors, ready to fight for their future. The human captain, a seasoned warrior named Commander Reese, looked out at the vast expanse of space. He had heard the stories of the Xylox, of their godlike powers and their ruthless conquest. But Reese wasn't afraid. He knew that the Xylox could be defeated, just like any other empire that thought it was invincible. We are not here to destroy their empire, Reese said, his voice calm but resolute. We are here to show them that no one is invincible, not even gods. And so the stage was set. The mighty Xylox, confident in their power, prepared to face what they believed would be an easy victory. But what they didn't know was that a single human warship, fueled by determination and the will to survive, was about to shatter their illusions of invincibility forever. The Xylox fleet surrounded their capital, Xyloth, their ships glowing with the brilliant blue and red of their advanced energy shields. The space around them was calm, but the air in the command center buzzed with nervous anticipation. The thought of a human ship challenging their mighty fleet was laughable, yet the whispers couldn't be silenced. As much as they tried to ignore it, the thought lingered. Commander Reese, on the other hand, was calm. Standing on the bridge of the warship, he looked out through the viewport, his expression unreadable. He didn't fear the Xylox, but he respected them. The Xylox were formidable opponents, their fleet massive, their warriors relentless. But no empire, no matter how powerful, was invincible. Approaching the Xylox capital, said Lieutenant Dara, her voice steady. We are almost within their detection range. Reese nodded. He could feel the heartbeat of his crew, their minds racing with the same question. Would they be enough? Would their ship and their will be enough to face down the invincible gods? But Reese knew the answer. It was never about size or strength. It was about strategy, courage, and belief in what they were fighting for. The human warship, though smaller than the Xylox ships, was a masterpiece of human ingenuity. Its sleek, dark hull was equipped with weapons designed not for sheer power, but for precision. It was built for speed, stealth, and above all survival. Every piece of technology, every weapon, had been carefully crafted for this moment. As the ship moved closer to Xyloth, the Xylox ships began to react. They first detected the human warship's strange energy signatures, disrupting their sensors and scanners. They hadn't encountered anything like this before. It wasn't the raw power of the ship that unnerved them, it was its ability to adapt, to shift in ways the Xylox couldn't predict. The Xylox fleet commander, Zoroth, stood on the bridge of his flagship, his eyes narrowing as he watched the approaching warship. It was smaller than the ships of his fleet, insignificant in his eyes. Yet the closer it came, the more unsettled he became. The human ship is within firing range, one of his commanders said, breaking the silence. Zorath's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Let's show them the power of the Xylox," he said, his voice cold. He turned to his tactical officer. "Prepare to fire. They will learn the true meaning of power." Just as the order was given, the human warship made its move. Evasive maneuvers. Reese barked, his hands flying across the controls. The ship darted through the void like a predator, its movements sharp and deliberate. The Xylox fired, their energy blasts lighting up the dark expanse of space. But the human warship was already gone, slipping between the enemy ships, evading each attack with impossible speed. Zorath watched in disbelief as the human ship outmaneuvered. His fleet, it wasn't just fast, calculating every move as if it knew the Xylox's every tactic. The warship twisted and turned, slipping in and out of their firing range like a shadow in the night. "Their ship is too fast," one of the Xylox commanders shouted. "We cannot hit it." Zoroth's mind raced. No ship had ever been able to outmaneuver the Xylox like this. It was as though the human ship was more than just a ship. It was a challenge to everything the Xylox had believed. For the first time, the arrogance of the Xylox gods began to waver. "They're trying to wear us down," Reese said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "They'll keep missing, keep firing, until they waste all their energy." With a calculated move, Reese ordered the human ship to launch a counterattack. The ship's weapons, small but precise, targeted the weaker points of the Xylox ships. A beam of energy fired from the warship's main cannon, striking one of the larger Xylox ships in the heart. The blast was so concentrated and precise that it pierced through the shield, cutting into the core of the vessel. The ship exploded in a burst of light, sending debris spinning into space. The Xylox was stunned. This wasn't just a warship, was a force to be reckoned with. One ship had just destroyed one of their fleet's most powerful vessels. The rumors were true. Humanity was not what the Xylox had expected. Zoroth's face twisted with fury. He ordered his fleet to concentrate fire on the human ship, but Reese was already several steps ahead. The human ship darted forward, breaking through the center of the Xylox fleet, its weapons tearing through shields and tearing apart ships with precise strikes. "We cannot hold out much longer," one of the Xylox commanders admitted, panic creeping into their voice. The Xylox fleet, once thought to be invincible, was now in disarray. The human warship, though outnumbered, had broken through their defenses, its captain a tactical genius. The gods had been challenged, and they had been forced to face the truth. No empire, no matter how mighty, was beyond defeat. Reinforcements are on the way. Zorath shouted, though his words lacked the conviction they once held. He was no longer the confident leader of an unbeatable empire. Doubt had begun to creep into his mind, and the sight of his fleet crumbling before a single human ship made him question everything. Reese's voice cut through the cums. "This is just the beginning. We've only just started to show you what humanity is capable of." The cold silence of space was broken only by the hum of the human warship's engines as it glided effortlessly through the chaos. The Xylox fleet, now thrown into disarray, desperately tried to regroup, but the human warship had already proven that it was no ordinary enemy. Commander Reese stood calmly on the bridge, his fingers lightly tapping the control panel as the battle raged on outside. His crew moved with swift precision, each person knowing their role and executing it flawlessly. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a statement. And Reese had every intention of making it clear: humanity would not be crushed Zora, the leader of the Xylox, seethed with anger as he watched the destruction unfold before him. His fleet was faltering, ships were being torn apart, and no matter how many of his commands were shouted, nothing seemed to stop the relentless human ship from tearing through their defenses. The once mighty Xylox were on the defensive now, scrambling to regroup their forces, but it was clear to Zorath that their vaunted invincibility was nothing more than a lie. "This can't be happening," Zorath muttered, clenching his fists. "We are gods. We cannot be beaten by one insignificant human vessel." Yet the human ship proved him wrong at every turn. It wasn't just outmaneuvering the Xylox, it was outthinking them, anticipating their moves. With every attack, every countermeasure, the humans seemed to know exactly what the Xylox were planning. It was as though they were reading the Xylox's every move before they even made it. In a final attempt to turn the tide, Zorath ordered his fleet to concentrate all their firepower on the human warship. Hundreds of Xylox vessels aligned there, weapons charging up for a devastating barrage. Their energy cannons pulsed with raw power, the beams of light cutting through the blackness of space like fiery lances. "Prepare to fire," Zorath shouted, his voice filled with frustration and desperation. "We will annihilate them with one blow." But Reese was already steps ahead, shields up, full evasive maneuvers, now. Reese barked, his voice unwavering. The human warships. Shields flickered briefly before flaring brightly with energy as the Xylox barrage rained down. But in the split second before the blast could land, the human ship veered off to the side with impossible speed, narrowly avoiding the attack. The Xylox fleet had been too predictable. They fired all at once, assuming the human ship would be caught in the full force of their attack. But instead, the warship danced through their lines, dodging every shot, each movement calculated, each decision deliberate. The human ship glided between their massive warships, weaving in and out of their fire, turning the tables with every strike. One by one, Xylox ships began to fall. With every pulse of the human warship's weapons, the Xylox fleet began to collapse. The human ship didn't rely on brute force. It was built to outthink and outlast. As the Xylox fired at the decoy targets' advanced holograms created by the warship's stealth systems, the real ship struck where they least expected it. A single shot from the human warship struck the flagship of the Xylox fleet. The blast was clean and direct, puncturing the Xylox ship's energy core and sending a shockwave through space. The explosion was massive, a burst of light that illuminated the surrounding void. For a moment, it seemed as if time had stopped. The entire Xylox fleet watched as their leader's flagship crumbled into nothingness. Zora stood in stunned silence as the remains of his flagship floated in pieces before him. The shock was too much. His fleet had just lost their most powerful ship to a single human vessel. His control over the situation slipped further away with each passing second. The gods of the Xylox were now just like every other fallen empire in history, broken and defeated. "We need reinforcements," Zorath muttered to himself, though his voice lacked its usual authority. The other commanders in his fleet could only look on helplessly. His empire was crumbling before him, and nothing seemed to stop the onslaught. The once feared Xylox fleet, which had conquered galaxies, was being brought to its knees by a single human warship. Back on the human ship, Reese felt the weight of the moment settle on him. He had expected resistance, but not like this. The Xylox were gods to many, and for them to fall so quickly, it was almost too easy. Still, he couldn't afford to underestimate them. The Xylox would fight until the very end, and that's exactly what they planned to do. He could sense the change in the battle, the shift in tactics. The Xylox would not give up so easily. "Keep the pressure on them," Rhys said, his voice calm but commanding. "We've broken their will, but they still have fight left in them. We need to finish this." As the battle raged on, the Xylox fleet continued to fire, but their aim was growing sloppier, their attacks less coordinated. The human warship continued to weave through the enemy lines, systematically dismantling their defenses with methodical precision. The once godlike fleet of the Xylox had become a shell of its former self, every ship they lost weakening their resolve. Zorath's mind raced. He had underestimated humanity. He had assumed that, like all the others, they would crumble under the weight of the Xylox Empire. But the humans weren't like the other races they had conquered. They had something that the Xylox could not replicate: the will to fight, to survive, and to stand up to what was once thought unchallengeable. And, as the Xylox fleet crumbled, Zoroth realized just how badly he had miscalculated. The Xylox were no longer the gods they once claimed to be. They were mere mortals, and one human warship had shattered their illusion of invincibility. The battle had shifted beyond any expectation. And now, in the quiet aftermath of the Xylox flagship's destruction, a slow, unsettling realization began to settle over the Xylox fleet. Their once unstoppable force was in chaos, their bravado shattered, their gods dethroned. Zoroth, towering and once so confident, stood like a statue, staring out into the vast emptiness of space, his mind whirling with disbelief that the human warship, seemingly small and insignificant, had dismantled their grand fleet in a matter of moments. No fleet had ever done that to the Xylox, and yet here they were, on the verge of total annihilation, at the hands of what they had once dismissed as a primitive species in the command center of the human warship. Commander Rhys remained calm. His focus never wavered. The battle was far from over. He knew that while the Xylox had been thrown into disarray, their pride and determination would push them to fight to the last. They were not going to surrender easily, but the damage had already been done. The human ship had proven that they could stand toe-to-toe with the so-called gods. "Rhys, we've taken down almost a third of their fleet," Lieutenant Dara reported, her voice filled with a mix of disbelief and awe. "We're making history, sir." Rhys nodded, but didn't allow himself the luxury of celebration. "It's not over yet. Keep up the pressure. They'll regroup, and when they do, we need to be ready." Despite the destruction they had already wrought, the Xylox weren't finished. Zorath, his face a mask of fury, slammed his fist onto the command console, sending sparks flying across the room. "Reinforcements are on the way," he growled. "Prepare to fire the Omega cannons. We'll make sure these humans regret ever entering our domain." The Omega cannons were the Xylox's most devastating weapon, capable of wiping out entire fleets with a single strike. The weapon was still in development, and many in the Empire believed it was their ultimate trump card. If Zorath could activate it, it would obliterate the human warship in one blow. But there was one problem: it took time to charge. As the Xylox scrambled to power up the Omega cannons, Rhys knew that they were close to deploying their most powerful weapon. He could feel the tension mounting. If the Omega cannons fired, everything would change. The odds would shift drastically, and the human warship would be no more. "We need to finish this before they fire," Rhys said, his voice quiet but firm. "Prepare for a final push. We have one shot at this." The human warship surged forward, weaving through the scattered remnants of the Xylox fleet. The remaining Xylox ships were disoriented, firing randomly and recklessly. Their once immaculate formations had broken down, and now they were vulnerable. The human warship locked onto its next targeter, massive Xylox destroyer, still intact but floating aimlessly, unable to coordinate with the rest of the fleet. Reese ordered an assault, and the warship's weapons opened fire, laser beams slashing through the silence of space. The Xylox destroyer was hit multiple times, shields flickering before finally collapsing under the strain. The destroyer exploded. In a burst of light, debris scattering into space. Another mighty vessel lost. But as the human warship prepared for its next target, a sudden surge of energy pierced the darkness. The Omega cannons were active. Zoroth's voice boomed through. The coms, now laced with desperation and rage. You will regret challenging us. Omega cannons fire. The space around the Xylox flagship lit up as the massive weapon charged. The air crackled with power. The Omega cannons fired. A beam of raw energy shot out from the Xylox flagship, cutting through the dark expanse of space like a blade. It was fast, and it was deadly. The human warship, despite its speed and agility, was headed directly into the path of the blast. For a split second, everything seemed to slow down. The battle paused as both sides braced for what was to come. The Omega cannons were unmatched, and the human warship was directly in its line of fire. But Commander Reese wasn't about to let their victory slip away. He made a decision in that moment, one that would define the outcome of this battle. Activate the warp drive, now. He shouted in a move that would leave the Xylox stunned. The human warship veered away from the incoming blast at the last possible second, activating its warp drive just as the Omega beam closed in. The ship disappeared in a flash of light, traveling faster than the Xylox could follow. Bypassing the Omega blast entirely, the Xylox commanders were left staring in disbelief. The Omega cannons had fired, and they had missed. What? How? Zorath gasped, his mind reeling. The Xylox had never faced anything like this. They had always been the ones to strike first, to obliterate their enemies with sheer power. Yet, here they were, outmaneuvered by the humans' ingenuity and speed. Their greatest weapon had failed. The human warship reappeared moments later, now in the perfect position to launch a devastating counterattack. Reese's face was a mask of determination as he ordered the final assault. Target the heart of their fleet. Full power to all weapons. Finish this. The human warship fired, unleashing a volley of energy blasts that tore through the Xylox's remaining ships. The Omega cannons might have been powerful, but the Xylox had underestimated what the humans were capable of. One by one, the ships began to fall, the once mighty fleet crumbling under the pressure. Zoroth watched in horror as his empire, his gods, were brought to their knees. His ships, his pride, his very identity, all of it was unraveling before his eyes. In the end, the Xylox were no gods at all. They were just another empire that had overestimated its own power. And now, humanity would ensure that they would never rise again. The final moments of the battle were unfolding with chilling clarity. The Xylox fleet, once an unstoppable force that had claimed dominance over entire galaxies, now lay scattered in the dark abyss of space. Their once proud ships were reduced to debris, their weapons useless against the precise strikes of the human warship. The invincible empire that had once boasted of its godlike power was now on the brink of total annihilation. Zorath, standing on the command bridge of the last remaining flagship, stared out at the remains of his fleet. His once pristine face Always the picture of arrogant confidence, now twisted in disbelief and humiliation. His hands trembled, clenching into fists. He had called himself a god, and now, here he was defeated by a species he had long regarded as insignificant. This cannot be happening, Zorath muttered to himself. His voice was barely a whisper, filled with a mixture of rage and sorrow. How did this happen? How could a single human warship destroy us? The truth was inescapable, and Zoroth knew it. The Xylox had failed. The humans weren't just a random force, they were a new, powerful force in the universe. A force the Xylox had underestimated. The Xylox, for all their strength, were nothing more than a passing shadow in the face of humanity's will to survive and rise above. In the silence that followed, Commander Reese stood calmly at the helm of the human warship. He had seen the truth in Zoroth's eyes. The One's mighty empire was broken, and though Reese had accomplished what seemed impossible, he knew that this was not the time to gloat. The war was not yet won, and there were still forces out there that would challenge humanity, but for now they had proved their point. Target the flagship, Reese ordered. We end this now. His voice was steady, the calm of a leader who had already seen the battle won in his mind before it was even fought. The human warship maneuvered with precision, locking onto the last of the Xylox ships. The fleet's final defense had failed, and now the heart of the Xylox Empire was vulnerable. The Xylox flagship, still firing sporadically in a futile attempt to defend itself, was slowly coming apart. The human ship's weapons, laser-accurate, continued their assault, weakening the flagship's shields bit by bit. As each shot struck, the once immense power of the Xylox Empire continued to falter. Zorath watched helplessly as the ship's systems flickered and shut down. His flagship, the symbol of the Xylox's godlike power, was dying. His last hope was being destroyed by the very species he had once dismissed as insignificant, and all he could do was watch. I never believed it would come to this, Zoroth muttered, his voice hoarse. How could we fall? How could we be defeated by them? One of the Xylox officers, bloodied and bruised from the battle, looked up at Zoroth, their eyes wide with fear. Sir, we have no more options. The humans have broken through our final defenses. We're losing control of the flagship. Zorath stood still, frozen in disbelief. This wasn't the way it was supposed to end. The Xylox were supposed to be the rulers of the universe, untouchable, invincible. They had crushed civilizations, made entire species bow before them, and yet now it was they who were kneeling, facing the wrath of a force they could never have imagined. Meanwhile, aboard the human warship, Reese gave the order to fire one last time. This was the final blow. The weapons charged, releasing a powerful beam that ripped through the Xylox flagship's energy core. The explosion was almost deafening, the shockwaves sending ripples through space. The flagship crumbled in the blink of an eye, disintegrating into dust. A once great empire, a civilization that had ruled with godlike arrogance, was gone. The Xylox were no more. But it wasn't just the destruction of the fleet that defined this moment. It was the message that humanity had sent across the stars. The Xylox had fallen, and with them the illusion that anyone, any empire was beyond the reach of humanity. On the bridge of the human warship, the crew stood silent, watching as the Xylox flagship shattered into pieces. Reese took a deep breath, the weight of victory settling over him. They had done it. Against all odds, against a seemingly invincible enemy, humanity had triumphed. But Reese knew this wasn't the end. The universe was vast, and other threats were waiting in the darkness. This victory, however, was a reminder of what humanity was capable of, a force that could never be underestimated. As Reese turned to face his crew, he spoke words that would echo throughout the history of humanity's rise to power. This is only the beginning. They thought they were gods, but now they know the truth, and the galaxy will never forget that humanity stood up when no one else would. In the distance, the remnants of the Xylox fleet drifted through space, a broken shadow of what it once was, and above all, the stars gleamed a little brighter as humanity's light shone through.